The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was louder than a gunshot. Victoria didn't just sign the divorce papers. She scribbled her name with a smirk, pushed the document across the greasy workbench of the auto shop, and wiped her hands as if she had just touched something filthy. She looked at her husband, a man who had worked 12-hour shifts fixing cars for 3 long years to pay off her law school debt, and laughed. "You were just a stepping stone. Adrian, I need a king, not a grease monkey." She thought she had won. She thought she was free. She had no idea that the man she just discarded was the most feared mafia boss on the entire East Coast, and her signature just cost her everything. If you want to see how this gripping story unfolds, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. And that's how a single, contemptuous signature caused a woman to lose everything she thought she had gained. The fluorescent lights in Tony's auto shop flickered as if they themselves couldn't bear to witness what had just happened. The smell of motor oil and rubber mixed with the expensive perfume Victoria had sprayed on herself, creating a suffocating contrast. She stood up, smoothed her charcoal gray Armani suit, then looked down at Adrian as if she were staring at an oil stain on the concrete floor. "You can keep this garage," Victoria said, her voice sweet in a way that was painfully fake. "I think it suits you perfectly. The grease, the roaring engines, and those tiny little dreams." She let out a mocking laugh, then turned on her heel and walked toward the wide-open garage door. The late afternoon sunlight poured in, framing a perfect picture of a bright red Porsche Carrera parked just outside. Leaning against that car was Derek Hamilton, the son of the senior partner at Hamilton & Associates, the firm where Victoria had just been promoted to junior partner. He was tall, his hair neatly styled with expensive gel, wearing a white shirt with the top 2 buttons undone, revealing a gleaming gold chain. Derek smiled when he saw Victoria step out, the smile of a winner looking down on the defeated. "All done, babe?" Derek asked loudly enough for Adrian to hear. Victoria didn't answer with words. She walked straight to Derek, slipped her arms around his neck, and kissed him right there in front of the garage. It wasn't a hurried kiss. It was slow, deliberate, and intoxicating, calculated so Adrian would be forced to witness every second of it. The other mechanics in the garage stood frozen. Jenny, the 50-year-old manager who had worked there for 20 years, clenched her cleaning rag so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to run outside and slap that ungrateful woman across the face, but she knew it wasn't her place. Adrian stood still like a statue. Not a single muscle in his face moved. He just stared, his deep blue eyes unblinking. Anyone else would have thought he was shattered, completely broken. But if they had looked closer, they would have seen something else. A cold glint was forming at the bottom of his gaze, like a lake freezing over in winter. Derek finally released Victoria and glanced into the garage with open contempt. He spoke loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "Hey man, next time remember to change my oil, okay? Oh wait, you can't afford a car to change oil for." He laughed loudly as if he'd just told the greatest joke in the world. Victoria laughed along, her sharp laughter echoing through the garage. She opened the car door and slid into the passenger seat, but before closing it, she looked back at Adrian one last time. 3 years, Adrian. 3 years I had to endure the smell of grease on you every night. 3 years pretending a $400 a month rental apartment was good enough. 3 years telling my friends my husband was a mechanic while they bragged about husbands who were doctors, lawyers, executives. She shook her head as if she pitied him. "But thank you for paying off my student loans. Without you, I couldn't have become a lawyer. Now I am a lawyer, and I don't need you anymore." Derek started the engine, the Porsche's roar sounding like a deliberate taunt. Victoria slammed the door shut, rolled down the window, and waved at Adrian with her perfectly manicured fingers. "Goodbye, ex-husband. I hope you have a wonderful life with your broken cars." The red Porsche sped away, leaving behind a trail of smoke and the sharp smell of burnt rubber in the air. Adrian watched until the car disappeared at the end of the road. Around him, the garage fell into absolute silence. No one dared to speak. Jenny slowly walked up beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Son, I'm so sorry. Do you want to go home and rest? I'll take care of the garage today." Adrian didn't turn around. He kept staring at the empty road where the red Porsche had vanished. And then something strange happened. Adrian smiled. It wasn't the broken laughter of a betrayed man. It wasn't the mad laughter of someone who had lost his mind. It was low, cold, and so unsettling that Jenny instinctively took a step back. When Adrian finally turned, his eyes were completely different. The eyes of the gentle, long-suffering mechanic were gone. In their place were the eyes of a predator, cold and calculating. "Jenny," Adrian said, and his voice was no longer the voice she had known for the past 3 years. It was the voice of someone accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. "Thank you for taking care of me, but I'm afraid today is my last day working here." Jenny stared at Adrian with her eyes wide open, unable to understand what was happening. She had grown used to the gentle Adrian, the man who always arrived first and left last, the man who never complained even when he was given the dirtiest jobs. But the man standing in front of her now was someone else entirely. Adrian walked toward his personal locker in the corner of the garage, each step steady and filled with quiet authority. He opened the locker and took out a black leather bag she had never seen before. Then, right in front of everyone, Adrian pulled off the grease-stained gray t-shirt. The mechanics in the garage inhaled sharply in unison. On Adrian's right arm, stretching from shoulder to elbow, was a tattoo so intricate it seemed unreal. It was the image of a snarling wolf, fangs bared, claws sharp, with the word Volkov written beneath it in ancient Russian lettering. Surrounding the wolf were black roses and stars, symbols of power and blood that had been spilled. Anyone on the east coast of the United States with even a basic understanding of the underworld knew what that tattoo meant. It was the crest of the Volkov family, one of the most powerful Russian mafia organizations, controlling everything from seaports to casinos, from real estate to deals no one dared mention in daylight. Tommy, a young mechanic who had only been working there for 6 months, dropped his wrench onto the concrete floor with a sharp metallic crash. He stammered, "You're Volkov? You're the boss Volkov?" Adrian didn't answer. He put on a black dress shirt from the bag and buttoned it slowly, like a man who no longer had to hurry for anyone. From the bottom of the bag, he took out a black satellite phone, the kind no ordinary person could buy no matter how much money they had. He dialed a single number and waited. It rang once. A deep voice answered on the other end, without greeting, only absolute readiness. "Yes, sir." Adrian spoke in Russian, his voice cold as ice. "Nikolai, come get me. Tony's auto shop garage, outskirts of Newark. The test is over." He hung up without waiting for a reply, because he knew his orders never needed confirmation. Jenny trembled as she stepped closer to Adrian. She was the only one in the garage who dared to speak. "Who are you? For 3 years you've worked here. I thought I knew you." Adrian turned to her, and for a brief moment, his gaze softened. "Mrs. Jenny, you're a good woman. You treated me like your own son for 3 years. I won't forget that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. "This garage will belong to you starting today. The paperwork will arrive within the week, and everyone who works here will receive a bonus equal to 1 year of salary. That's my thank you." Jenny wanted to refuse, wanted to ask more questions, but the distant roar of engines cut through her thoughts. Everyone in the garage rushed to the door to look. First came 3 glossy black SUVs, the kind of vehicles people only saw in movies about secret agents or presidents. They moved in formation, imposing and threatening. Behind them was a jet-black Rolls-Royce Phantom, its metal gleaming in the afternoon sun like a waking beast. The convoy stopped in front of the garage, engines still humming smoothly. The door of the first SUV opened and a man stepped out. He was about 45 years old, with neatly cropped salt and pepper hair, a sharp angular face marked by a long scar running from his temple to his cheekbone. He wore a black 3-piece suit with a gray vest underneath, and his gray eyes swept over the garage as if assessing the danger level of every person inside. It was Nikolai Petrov, former assassin of the organization, now the right hand and most loyal man of Adrian Volkov. He walked up to Adrian and bowed his head slightly in absolute respect. "Welcome back, sir. We've waited a long time for this day." Adrian nodded and walked toward the Rolls-Royce. Nikolai quickly moved ahead to open the door for him. Before getting in, Adrian turned and looked at the garage one last time. The place where he had spent 3 years of his life testing a woman, and that woman had failed miserably. 3 years, he murmured. 3 years living like a man with nothing, just to see if she truly loved me. And the answer was divorce papers and a kiss with another man right in front of me. He stepped into the car and the door closed with a soft click. Inside, cream-colored leather and polished walnut wood surrounded him, completely separated from the world of grease and sweat outside. Nikolai took the front seat beside the driver and looked back at Adrian through the rearview mirror. "About Mrs. Katerina, sir. She's kept everything in order for the past 3 years. She's been eager to see you again." Adrian looked out the window as the convoy began to move, Tony's auto shop shrinking behind them. "My mother was always right," he said quietly. "She said no woman was worth my sacrifice. I didn't believe her, and I wasted 3 years proving she was right." The convoy merged onto the highway, heading toward Manhattan, where the 50-story Volkov Tower waited for its true owner to return. And somewhere in the city, Victoria was laughing inside her red Porsche, completely unaware that a storm was forming, and she was the only target at its center. The convoy glided through the crowded streets of Manhattan like a black serpent sliding through a sea of people. Yellow taxis hurriedly pulled to the curb to make way. Pedestrians stopped and stared with a mix of curiosity and fear. Everyone knew what kind of people traveled in convoys like this, and no one wanted to stand in their path. Volkov Tower appeared before Adrian like an old friend waiting patiently. 50 stories of glass and steel rose into the sky, the crown of the tower shaped like a wolf's head, the symbol of the Volkov bloodline. The building stood firmly in the heart of Manhattan's financial district, a silent reminder that true power doesn't need to shout to be acknowledged. The Rolls-Royce stopped at the main entrance, where 2 lines of men in black suits stood along a red carpeted path. Nikolai opened the car door, and Adrian stepped out, the afternoon sun bathing him like a halo. "Welcome back, Mr. Volkov." The voices rang out in unison, heads bowed in absolute respect. These weren't ordinary office employees. These were people who had followed the Volkov family for generations, people who knew loyalty was rewarded with gold, and betrayal was paid in blood. Adrian passed through the bulletproof glass revolving doors and entered the main lobby. White marble floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, walls adorned with masterpieces no amount of money could buy at any auction. At the center of the lobby stood a bronze statue of a wolf howling at the moon, nearly 3 meters tall, a symbol of the family's power and dominance. And standing directly beneath that statue was a woman, Katerina Volkov, 62 years old, yet time itself seemed afraid to touch her. Her silver hair was styled in an elegant bun, her face still bearing the sharp lines of classic Russian beauty. She wore a long black gown that brushed the floor, a rare black pearl necklace at her throat, rumored to be worth an entire small island. But the most frightening thing about her wasn't her jewelry or her clothing. It was her eyes, deep blue eyes identical to Adrian's, cold as a Siberian winter and sharp as a blade. "My son," Katerina said, her voice filling the vast lobby without needing to rise, heavy with authority. "At last, you've awakened." Adrian stepped forward and kissed her cheek in the traditional greeting. "Mother, I'm home." Katerina lifted a hand to his face, her fingers cold and dry like paper. 3 years, Adrian. 3 years you vanished to chase a woman who wasn't worthy of your fingernails. I warned you, but you didn't listen. I know you were right, Adrian replied, his voice free of shame or regret, holding only the cold acknowledgement of a lesson learned. I needed to prove it myself. I needed to know whether she loved me or what I could give her. And the answer? Katerina asked, her eyes narrowing. Adrian smiled, the smile never reaching his eyes. She threw $100 in my face and told me to buy better clothes. Then she kissed another man right in front of me. Before driving away, she even thanked me for paying off her student loans. Katerina's expression didn't change, but the air around her seemed to drop several degrees. She turned to Nikolai, who stood silently behind her like a shadow. What's the name of that woman? Victoria Hayes, ma'am, Nikolai replied without hesitation, currently a junior partner at Hamilton and Associates, in a relationship with Derek Hamilton, son of senior partner Richard Hamilton. Hamilton. Katerina repeated the name as if tasting cheap wine. I know him. Richard Hamilton owes our organization $20 million from loans he took while gambling out of control in Atlantic City. He's been hiding and begging for extensions. Adrian absorbed the information, and a slow smile spread across his lips. Interesting. So the woman who left me is sleeping with the son of a man who owes me money. Katerina nodded, then extended her hand. Resting in her palm was a solid gold key, the symbol of authority of the Volkov leader. It's time you reclaim what's yours, Adrian. I've safeguarded this empire for 3 years, but the throne has only one true owner. Adrian took the key, feeling its weight in his hand. This wasn't just a key. It was the symbol of absolute power, of life and death, of heaven and hell he could grant to anyone he chose. Thank you, Mother, Adrian said. And I'm sorry I doubted your counsel. Katerina shook her head. No apology is needed. You're a man. You had to experience it yourself to understand. Now you understand. Do what you must. She tilted her head, her gaze razor sharp. But Adrian, don't rush. Don't kill her too quickly. Traitors need to understand the value of what they've thrown away before they lose everything. Let her climb as high as she can. A fall from the rooftop hurts far more than a fall from the basement. Adrian bowed to his mother one last time and stepped into the private elevator. 50 floors passed in silence, and when the doors opened, he stood before his office. The vast room had glass walls overlooking all of Manhattan, a black oak desk worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, in a leather chair only one man was ever allowed to sit in. Adrian walked to the window and looked down at the city spread beneath him. Somewhere in that maze of buildings, Victoria was celebrating her victory. She thought she'd escaped a poor mechanic to soar into a life of luxury. She didn't know she'd just started a war with the most dangerous man on the East Coast. "Nikolai," Adrian called without turning, "gather everything on Hamilton and Associates. Finances, personnel, clients, scandals, and every skeleton in every closet they think is buried. I want it all." "Yes, sir," Nikolai replied. "And Victoria Hayes?" Adrian turned, his eyes frozen steel. "She wanted a king instead of a mechanic. Then I'll show her what a real king looks like. But not yet. Let her enjoy a few more weeks of happiness. Hell doesn't rush, Nikolai, and I've got a lifetime to wait." While Adrian sat on his throne on the 50th floor of Volkov Tower, planning every move, Victoria was living what she believed were the happiest days of her life. Or at least, that was what she told herself. That night, Derek took her to Le Bernardin, one of the most expensive restaurants in New York, a place where a single dinner could swallow what Adrian used to earn in an entire month working at the garage. At least, that was what Victoria believed. They sat at a VIP table by the window, overlooking the glittering streets of Manhattan. Derek ordered a bottle of Chateau Margaux, 1992, a wine whose price alone could make most people lose their breath. He raised his glass, his eyes fixed on Victoria with a carefully calculated look of devotion. "Congratulations on your freedom, Victoria. Congratulations on escaping that ordinary life with the mechanic." Victoria clinked her glass against his, the crystal ringing clear and delicate like a bell. She took a sip, felt the expensive flavor spread across her tongue, and smiled. "I still can't believe I endured 3 years, she said, shaking her head as if recalling a nightmare. 3 years waking up in that cramped apartment, smelling motor oil on my pillow, watching him leave for work in that dull gray uniform. I thought it was love, but it turns out I was just investing in the wrong place." Derek laughed and placed his hand over hers. "You were smart to cut your losses at the right time. Now you have me, and I'll give you the life you deserve. My father is very impressed with you, Victoria. He says you have a bright future at Hamilton and Associates." Hearing those words, Victoria felt as if she were floating. She had been right to leave Adrian. She had been right to choose Derek. She had been right to believe she deserved a better life. 1 week later, Victoria officially moved into Derek's penthouse on the Upper East Side. The apartment sat on the 40th floor of a luxury building, with sweeping views of Central Park and the Hudson River. Italian marble floors, interiors designed by Europe's most famous designers, and a private rooftop infinity pool. Victoria stepped inside, her mouth falling open in awe despite her attempt to hide it. "This is real life," she whispered. "This is what I deserve." She spent the entire first day exploring the penthouse, opening every closet and every drawer. Derek had prepared a private dressing room just for her, filled with designer dresses from Chanel, Dior, and Valentino. High heels lined the shelves like works of art. Hermès and Louis Vuitton bags stacked neatly in the corner. Everything was authentic, not the discreet knockoffs she had once secretly bought while living with Adrian. She photographed everything and posted it on social media with the caption, "A new chapter, a new me. Life begins at 32. Her friends, the ones who had stayed silent when she married a mechanic, now flooded the comments with congratulations and envy. Victoria read every comment, her smile growing wider with each one. She had been right. She had always been right. The days that followed passed like a dream. Derek took her shopping along Fifth Avenue, where sales staff bowed and served her like a queen. He bought her a diamond-studded Cartier watch, a Tiffany bracelet, and a pair of black pearl earrings whose price Victoria didn't dare ask. Every night they dined at a different restaurant, from Per Se to 11 Madison Park, from Masa to Daniel. Victoria learned how to read menus in French, how to taste wine like a connoisseur, how to speak about art and classical music even though she understood none of it. She was learning how to become a new Victoria, a Victoria of the elite, a Victoria worthy of Derek Hamilton. And she completely forgot Adrian. The man who had worked 12 hours a day to pay off her debts was now nothing more than a stain in her past, a youthful mistake she believed she had corrected just in time. She didn't know that with every photo she posted online, a man on the 50th floor of Volkov Tower received a report. She didn't know that with every luxury item she bought, Nikolai recorded it in a ledger. She didn't know that every time she laughed in Derek's arms, Adrian added another line to his plan. Victoria thought she was climbing to the peak of life. She didn't know she was climbing to the top of a tower someone was already prepared to push her from, and that someone was waiting with the patience of a man who had spent his entire life waiting. 2 weeks after moving into the penthouse, Victoria walked into Hamilton and Associates with an entirely different presence. She was no longer the young lawyer anxious about rent and student debt. She was Victoria Hayes, Derek Hamilton's girlfriend, the future daughter-in-law of the senior partner and the firm's rising star. People looked at her differently now. Colleagues who once looked down on her for having a mechanic husband now nodded with respect. Secretaries who used to whisper behind her back now hurried to open doors when they saw her coming. Victoria took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of leather from her new Hermes bag and the Chanel No. 5 perfume Derek had given her. This was the life she had been born to live. That morning, Richard Hamilton summoned her to the main conference room. He sat at the head of the long mahogany table, with Derek beside him and 3 other senior partners from the firm. Victoria stepped in, forcing herself to remain calm even as her heart pounded. "Have a seat, Victoria," Richard Hamilton said, his voice unusually warm. "We have good news for you." Victoria sat in the leather chair across from him, her hands neatly folded on the table. She noticed Derek smiling at her, a smile full of promise. Richard Hamilton slid a thick file folder toward her. "The Westbrook Group. Do you know them?" Victoria nodded. Of course she did. Westbrook was one of the largest real estate conglomerates on the East Coast, owning dozens of skyscrapers and shopping centers across New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. "They're preparing a merger valued at $500 million, Victoria said, showing her knowledge. "With Morrison Real Estate. This will be one of the biggest deals of the year." "Exactly," Richard Hamilton said, nodding, clear satisfaction on his deeply lined face. "And Westbrook has chosen Hamilton and Associates as their legal representative. This is the largest case in our firm's history." Victoria felt her heart skip a beat. She understood what this meant, yet she scarcely dared believe it. "We want you to lead the legal team on this case," Richard Hamilton continued, his tone solemn, as if awarding a medal. "You've proven your capability, and Derek has assured us you're the right person. This is your opportunity to prove you deserve a senior partner position in the near future." Victoria was momentarily speechless. She looked at Derek, who nodded encouragingly, then back at Richard Hamilton, who waited for her response. This was everything she had ever dreamed of. This was why she had studied relentlessly for years, why she had endured 3 years with a mechanic to pay her tuition. And now, that dream was within reach. "I'm honored to accept this responsibility," Victoria said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "I won't disappoint you." Richard Hamilton smiled and stood to shake her hand. "I believe you. Welcome to the League of Major Players, Victoria." In the weeks that followed, Victoria threw herself into her work. She arrived at the office at 6 in the morning and didn't return home until 11 at night. She read thousands of pages of documents, met with dozens of experts, and prepared the most flawless presentation possible. She hired a team of 12 lawyers to work under her, managing them with an iron hand wrapped in velvet. Victoria knew this was her only chance. If she succeeded, she would become the youngest senior partner in the firm's history. She would have money, power, status. She would prove to everyone that she was no longer a small-town girl from New Jersey. She was Victoria Hayes, attorney for billion-dollar deals. The presentation to Westbrook's board was scheduled for Monday the following week. Victoria had prepared everything down to the finest detail. She had even commissioned a new suit from her favorite designer, navy blue with razor-sharp tailoring, to make the strongest possible impression. She stood before the mirror in the penthouse dressing room, studying her reflection and smiling. "This is the real Victoria," she whispered. "Not the girl burdened with student debt, not the mechanic's wife, but Victoria Hayes, Queen of Manhattan." She didn't know that on the 50th floor of Volkov Tower, Adrian was also looking at the calendar and smiling. "Monday next week," he murmured to Nikolai standing beside him. "That's the perfect day to begin. Make sure everything is ready." Nikolai nodded. "All the pieces are in position, sir. We just need to make the first move." Adrian turned back toward the window, his gaze cold as a winter night. "Then let the game begin." The conference room on the 49th floor of Volkov Tower had no windows. It was a deliberate design, because whatever was discussed inside this room was never meant to see the light of day. The long rectangular conference table made of black oak could seat 20 people, but tonight only 7 were present. 7 of the most powerful figures within the Volkov organization, men who controlled everything from seaports to casinos, from real estate to dealings the press would never hear about. Adrian sat at the head of the table, Nikolai standing directly behind him like a loyal shadow. Across from him sat 5 men with weathered faces and cold eyes. They were the captains, the men who ran different branches of the Volkov Empire, and they had been waiting for the true leader to return for 3 long years. "You all know why I called this meeting," Adrian began, his voice carrying through the silent room. "For 3 years, I was absent to handle a personal matter. That matter is over, and now I need your support for a special operation. Viktor Kozlov, the man in charge of the organization's finances, a 50-year-old with eyes sharp as knives, spoke up. We stand ready to serve, sir. Please state the target. Adrian nodded to Nikolai, and his loyal aide pressed a button on the console. A large screen on the wall lit up, displaying the logo of Hamilton & Associates, along with layers of financial data. This is Hamilton & Associates, Adrian said. A mid-sized law firm in Manhattan with approximately 150 employees. Annual revenue around $80 million. On the surface, they appear stable. He switched slides, revealing a web of debts and questionable transactions. In reality, they're on the brink of collapse. Richard Hamilton, senior partner and founder, has been embezzling company funds to gamble in Atlantic City. He's lost $20 million in just the past 2 years. To cover it up, he borrowed from multiple sources, including our organization. A low murmur spread across the room. Victor frowned. I remember that loan. Hamilton has asked for extensions 3 times and hasn't paid a single dollar. How much of his debt do we hold? $5 million, Adrian replied. But that's not all. He also owes First National Bank $12 million, BlackRock $8 million, and several smaller loans totaling roughly $5 million more. In total, Richard Hamilton is about $30 million in debt and unable to repay it. Adrian stood and slowly walked around the table as he continued. This is my plan. Victor, I want you to contact First National and BlackRock. Buy all of Hamilton's debt from them. Pay above face value if necessary. I want us to be Richard Hamilton's sole creditor within 48 hours. Victor nodded, his fingers already tapping messages to his finance team. But sir, he asked without looking up, what's the end goal? We could force repayment and push Hamilton into bankruptcy right now. Adrian smiled, the expression cold as ice. That's how impatient men operate. Victor, I don't want Hamilton bankrupt. Not yet. I want control. He turned back to the screen and advanced to the next slide, revealing a photo of Victoria. This is Victoria Hayes, newly promoted junior partner at Hamilton & Associates. She's leading the Westbrook merger valued at $500 million, the largest deal in the firm's history. If it succeeds, she becomes senior partner. The room fell silent. No one dared ask, but everyone understood there was a connection between the woman on the screen and their leader. Adrian answered their unspoken question. She's my ex-wife, he said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. She filed for divorce 2 weeks ago, after 3 years of me pretending to be a mechanic to test her loyalty. She threw $100 in my face, called me a mechanic, and kissed her lover right in front of me. That lover is Derek Hamilton, Richard Hamilton's son. Now they understood. This wasn't just business. This was revenge. In their world, revenge was a perfectly acceptable motive, sometimes even more respected than profit. Adrian continued. I don't want to destroy Victoria immediately. I want her to climb as high as possible, so when she falls, she feels the height she's lost. So this is what we'll do. He issued a series of precise instructions. Acquire Hamilton's debt, but don't call it in. Let the firm operate normally for a few more weeks. Allow Victoria to complete the Westbrook presentation. Let her believe she's won. Then, at the moment she's happiest, bring it all down. After that moment, I'll contact Westbrook's chief executive. We'll make him an offer he can't refuse. Volkov Holdings will acquire Westbrook at a price 20% higher than the current merger deal. The only condition is that he immediately fires Hamilton & Associates and transfers all legal work to our firm. Victor frowned. Sir, 20% higher means tens of millions more. Is it worth it? Adrian locked eyes with him, his gaze cold as a Siberian winter. Victor, there are things money can't buy. And there are things money must buy. This is the second kind. Follow my orders and don't question the cost. The value of revenge isn't measured in dollars. The meeting concluded half an hour later. Every detail perfectly aligned. When the captains left, only Adrian and Nikolai remained in the quiet room. Are you certain about this? Nikolai asked, his voice low and cautious. She's just one woman. Is she worth this much effort? Adrian stood and walked to the bare wall, staring into empty space as if looking through it. 3 years, Nikolai. 3 years I worked like a dog to pay her debts. I came home with my hands burning from engine oil, and she recoiled from the smell on me. I gave her every dollar I earned, and she hid money to buy designer goods. I loved her with everything a man could give, and she threw $100 at my face like I was a beggar. He turned to Nikolai, his deep blue eyes burning with a cold fire. This isn't about money, Nikolai. This is about principle. No one humiliates Adrian Volkov and lives peacefully. No one. Nikolai bowed his head. I understand, sir. The game begins next Monday. Adrian nodded and turned back toward the city lights beyond the walls. Manhattan glowing like a field of stars. Somewhere in that city, Victoria was sleeping soundly in Derek Hamilton's penthouse, dreaming of her brilliant future. She didn't know the nightmare was about to begin. Monday arrived faster than Victoria had expected. She woke at 5 in the morning, showered carefully, applied her makeup to perfection, and put on the navy suit she had custom-made for this very day. Derek was still sleeping deeply, but she didn't need him awake to see her off. Today was her day, the day Victoria Hayes would prove to the world that she deserved the highest seat at the table. She arrived at the office at 7, a full 2 hours before the presentation. Her team of 12 lawyers was already there, every one of them dressed impeccably, documents prepared down to the smallest detail. The largest conference room at Hamilton & Associates had been arranged with fresh flowers, premium beverages, and the most advanced presentation screens money could buy. Everything was ready for the greatest performance of Victoria's career. At 8:30, the Westbrook delegation was supposed to arrive. Victoria stood by the window, looking down at the street below, waiting for the luxury cars carrying the board to appear. No one came. At 8:45, anxiety crept in. She checked her phone. No messages. No missed calls. She called the Westbrook chief executive's assistant. No answer. She called again. Still nothing. At 9, Richard Hamilton entered the conference room with a face as pale as a corpse. He was holding a sheet of paper, and the way his hand trembled as if gripping a death sentence made Victoria's stomach tighten. "What's going on, Mr. Hamilton?" she asked, forcing calm into her voice, though fear leaked through. Richard Hamilton said nothing. He simply handed her the paper with shaking fingers. Victoria looked down and read. It was a printed email from the office of Westbrook's chief executive. The message was brief and brutally cold, so much so that she had to read it 3 times to believe what she was seeing. Dear Hamilton and Associates, after careful consideration, Westbrook Group has decided to terminate our cooperation with your firm regarding the merger with Morrison Real Estate. We have received an acquisition offer from Volkov Holdings at a significantly higher valuation than the current agreement, and we have chosen to accept it. At the request of our new partner, we will be transferring all legal representation to their legal team. We thank you for your cooperation to date. Victoria stared at the name and felt as if a bucket of ice water had been poured over her head. Volkov Holdings. The name felt strangely familiar, yet she couldn't place where she had heard it. Who is Volkov Holdings? Victoria asked, her voice hoarse. Why would they step in like this? Richard Hamilton collapsed into a chair, his head falling into his hands. I don't know. No one knows. They came out of nowhere with an offer no one could refuse, more than 20% above what we negotiated. Westbrook had no reason to say no. Victoria felt the floor shifting beneath her feet, even though the room itself was utterly still. She had prepared for weeks for this day. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, had poured sweat and tears into this presentation, and now it was all gone because of an email, not even 100 words long. But why? She almost shouted. What did we do wrong? Why are they targeting us? No one had an answer. The team of 12 lawyers stood frozen, unsure what to do. Richard Hamilton sat motionless, his eyes empty. The conference room that had been filled with energy and hope moments earlier now felt as cold as a morgue. Victoria rushed out into the hallway, pulling out her phone and calling everyone she knew at Westbrook. No one answered. She called the company's main office, and the receptionist politely informed her that the chief executive was in a meeting with the new partner and couldn't take calls. The new partner, Volkov Holdings. Victoria leaned against the corridor wall, her legs going weak beneath her. This was a catastrophe. Not just a failure, but the total collapse of everything she had built over the past few weeks. The $500 million deal had slipped through her fingers like sand, and she had no idea why. Her phone vibrated. Derek. She answered immediately. I heard the news, Derek said, his voice tight. My father is furious. He says this is your fault. Derek. I don't know what's happening, Victoria whispered, her voice shaking. Who is Volkov Holdings? Why are they destroying us? Silence on the other end. Then Derek spoke slowly, his tone heavy with concern. Volkov Holdings is one of the most powerful conglomerates on the East Coast. They have a reputation for never acting without a reason. If they're targeting Hamilton and Associates, then someone in our firm has angered the wrong people. Victoria stood frozen. A wild thought flashed through her mind, but she dismissed it immediately. It couldn't be. Adrian was just a mechanic. There was no way he could be connected to this. Then why was her heart pounding so hard? Why did the name Volkov send a chill straight down her spine? She didn't know that this was only the opening move, and that the board still held many pieces yet to be moved. The next day, a second bomb exploded. Sterling Investments, the second largest client of Hamilton and Associates, sent an email announcing the termination of their contract. The reason given was brief and deliberately vague: a strategic legal restructuring. Richard Hamilton called the chief executive of Sterling, a man he had played golf with for 15 years. The call lasted only 30 seconds. "I'm sorry, Richard." The voice on the other end was cold and distant. "I can't tell you the reason, but trust me, you don't want to know." The line went dead, and the man never answered again. On the third day, 3 more clients walked away: Morrison Tech, the Golden Leaf restaurant chain, and Phoenix Capital Investment Fund. All of them sent nearly identical emails, filled with vague explanations and polite apologies. No one explained why. No one gave Hamilton and Associates a chance to persuade them to stay. They simply vanished, as if someone had whispered in their ears that remaining with this firm would be a fatal mistake. Rumors began spreading through Manhattan's legal circles. Some said Hamilton and Associates was under investigation. Some said Richard Hamilton had crossed dangerous people. Others whispered about a shadowy force targeting the firm, a force no one dared provoke. Those whispers traveled from office to office, from one cocktail party to another, until the name Hamilton and Associates became a name people wanted to avoid. Victoria watched everything collapse with horror in her eyes. In just 1 week, the firm lost more than 60% of its clients. Projected revenue for the coming year dropped from $80 million to less than $30 million. Senior lawyers began to leave, jumping to rival firms under the excuse of better offers. In truth, they were fleeing a sinking ship. Richard Hamilton became a completely different man. Once confident and commanding, he now looked like a wandering ghost in his own office. His eyes were hollow from sleepless nights, his hair uncombed, his suit perpetually wrinkled as if he'd slept in it. Victoria watched him make call after call, begging old friends, business partners, even former rivals. No one helped him. No one wanted to. One evening, Victoria accidentally overheard a phone call Richard Hamilton was having in his office. He was speaking to someone, his voice trembling and pleading. "I know I owe money. I'll pay. Please give me more time. I don't know who's doing this to me. Please tell me. I'll do anything." There was a long silence. Then Richard Hamilton shouted, "Who? Who bought all my debt? Why won't you tell me?" Victoria stood frozen outside the door. Debt? Who did Richard Hamilton owe? And why did it have anything to do with the firm's collapse? She had no answers. But a vague fear began to coil in her chest. Something was happening. Something far bigger than the loss of a few clients. On the 10th day, the Wall Street Journal ran a small article in its financial section. The headline read, "Volkov Holdings makes surprise acquisitions. Mysterious empire expands influence." Victoria read it on her phone during lunch. The article described how Volkov Holdings was quietly acquiring companies and debt across the East Coast, extending its reach into real estate, finance, and legal services. And in the middle of the article was a photograph of the chief executive of Volkov Holdings, a man who rarely appeared in public. Victoria stared at the image, and her phone nearly slipped from her hand. The face was painfully familiar, sharp and cold, with deep blue eyes like the ocean at night. It was Adrian. Not Adrian in oil-stained work clothes. This was Adrian in a black 3-piece suit, wearing an expensive watch, standing before a 50-story tower with the bearing of a king. The caption beneath the photo read, "Adrian Volkov, CEO of Volkov Holdings, one of the most powerful men on the East Coast of the United States." "No," Victoria whispered, her voice shaking. "It can't be. He was just a mechanic. He had nothing. He was nobody." But the photograph didn't lie, and the surname Volkov, the name she'd ignored when Adrian signed the divorce papers, suddenly echoed in her mind like a funeral bell. Adrian Volkov. Her ex-husband wasn't a poor mechanic at all. He was the head of the Volkov empire, and she had just thrown $100 in his face. Victoria didn't sleep that night. She lay on the king-size bed in Derek's penthouse, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling while her thoughts spun out of control. Adrian was Volkov. Adrian was a mafia boss. Adrian was the man destroying her life. The questions circled her mind like a storm with no end. Why had he pretended to be a mechanic? Why had he endured 3 years in that cramped apartment? Why hadn't he told her who he really was? And most of all, why was his revenge so merciless? Derek lay beside her, breathing evenly in his sleep, completely unaware of the earthquake tearing through Victoria's mind. She wanted to wake him, to tell him everything, but she didn't dare. She feared his reaction. She feared he would blame her for dragging the Hamilton family into a war with one of the most dangerous men in America. The next morning, Victoria arrived at the office with dark circles under her eyes and heavy steps. The atmosphere at Hamilton and Associates was darker than ever. Half the desks were empty. The remaining lawyers sat in silence with anxious faces, and Richard Hamilton had locked himself in his office since early morning. At 10, a company-wide notice went out. Emergency all-staff meeting in the main conference room at 10:30. Attendance is mandatory. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. She knew something terrible was coming. She just didn't know how terrible it would be. The main conference room was packed. Around 60 remaining employees stood shoulder to shoulder, every face tense with fear. Richard Hamilton stood at the front, looking like a man already sentenced to death and waiting for the executioner. Derek stood beside his father, but he avoided Victoria's eyes, which only deepened her dread. "Colleagues," Richard Hamilton began, his voice hoarse and exhausted. "I've called this meeting to announce some major changes in the company's structure. As you know, we're going through a difficult period, and today, we'll meet the person who will decide the future of Hamilton and Associates." Murmurs spread through the room. Who would decide the firm's future? A new investor? A buyer? Victoria felt a chill crawl down her spine. She knew the answer before the door opened. And then he walked in. Adrian Volkov. No longer Adrian in a grease-stained gray uniform. No longer Adrian with hands rough from fixing cars. No longer the Adrian Victoria had despised and called a mechanic. The man who entered the conference room today was someone else entirely. He wore a perfectly tailored black three-piece suit, a crisp white shirt with a deep red silk tie, and polished leather shoes worth thousands of dollars at a glance. His black hair was neatly styled, his angular face cold as ice, and his deep blue eyes swept the room with the gaze of a king inspecting a newly conquered realm. Behind him walked Nikolai, the salt-and-pepper-haired man with the scarred face, and two other men in black suits, clearly bodyguards. Their presence radiated power and danger, silencing the room so completely that individual heartbeats could almost be heard. Victoria stood frozen in the corner. It felt as if all the air had been sucked from her lungs. Her legs went weak, and she had to grip the back of a chair to keep from collapsing. This couldn't be real. This had to be a nightmare. Adrian didn't look at her. He walked to the front of the room, standing beside Richard Hamilton as if the former senior partner were nothing more than a subordinate. Richard Hamilton, once powerful and commanding, now bowed his head before Adrian, like a dog before its master. "Good morning," Adrian said, his deep voice echoing through the room. "I'm Adrian Volkov, Chief Executive Officer of Volkov Holdings. As of today, Volkov Holdings officially owns 60% of Hamilton and Associates and holds all $30 million of debt owed by Richard Hamilton." Gasps rippled through the room. People stared at one another in horror. $30 million? Richard Hamilton owed someone $30 million? And Volkov Holdings had bought it all? Adrian raised a hand, and the room fell silent. "Don't worry," he said with a smile as cold as ice. "I've no intention of shutting the firm down. I'm simply making some necessary personnel changes." He turned to Nikolai, who handed him a stack of papers. "First, Richard Hamilton will step down from his position as senior partner, effective immediately. He'll have no further role in this firm." Richard Hamilton stood motionless, offering no protest. He was utterly defeated. "Second," Adrian continued calmly, as if reading a shopping list, "Derek Hamilton will also leave the firm, permanently." Derek stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "You've no right to do this." "I'm the founder's son." Adrian looked at him the way one looks at an insect. "You're the son of a man who owes me $30 million. You've no rights here. Security, escort Mr. Hamilton out." The two men in black stepped forward, each grabbing one of Derek's arms and dragging him from the room despite his shouted protests. Victoria watched with empty eyes. She wanted to run to Derek, but her legs refused to move. And third, Adrian finally turned his gaze toward Victoria. His deep blue eyes met her brown ones, and she felt herself freeze in place. There was no hatred in his eyes, no anger, only the cold emptiness of a man looking at a defeated enemy. "Miss Victoria Hayes." Adrian said her name as if reading an item from an inventory. "You're terminated for unsatisfactory performance. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out of the building. You've 10 minutes to collect your personal belongings." Victoria wanted to scream, to lash out, to run forward and slap him, but she couldn't move. She stood there trembling as the guards approached. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You can't do this. I'm your wife." Adrian tilted his head, as if trying to recall a distant memory. "Wife?" he asked coldly. "I recall you signing divorce papers and calling me a mechanic. I recall you kissing your lover in front of me. I recall you throwing $100 in my face and telling me to buy new clothes." He stepped closer, close enough for her to smell the expensive cologne on him. You wanted a king instead of a mechanic, Victoria. Well, now you've met the real king. He turned away without another glance. Take her out. Victoria was dragged out of the conference room like a criminal. 2 security guards gripped her arms, not brutally, but with no gentleness whatsoever. She could feel dozens of eyes following her. Colleagues she had once looked down on, people she had once ordered around, now watching as she was thrown out like a stray dog. No one spoke up for her. No one dared. The 10 minutes she was given to collect her belongings passed like a nightmare. Victoria shoved a few personal items into the Hermes bag Derek had bought her, her hands shaking so badly she dropped her pen case on the floor. She didn't dare look in the mirror. She didn't want to see her own face like this. She just wanted to get out, away from the curious and pitying stares, away from the place where only hours earlier she had been the rising star. When she stepped out of the Hamilton and Associates building, Victoria felt as if she had been pushed from heaven straight into hell. The harsh sunlight burned her eyes, and she stood frozen on the sidewalk, not knowing where to go. Her phone buzzed nonstop, messages from acquaintances asking what had happened. News spread through Manhattan's legal circles like wildfire. Victoria Hayes, the golden girl of Hamilton and Associates, had been fired by her own ex-husband, who turned out to be the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast. She hailed a taxi and gave Derek's penthouse address. It was the only place she could go. She needed Derek. She needed someone to hold her and tell her everything would be all right. She needed to believe that even if she'd lost her job, she still had him. During the ride, Victoria kept calling Derek, but he didn't answer. She called a second time, a third, a fourth. Still nothing. Her anxiety grew with every unanswered ring. When the taxi stopped in front of the penthouse building, Victoria paid quickly and rushed inside. She took the elevator up to the 40th floor, her heart pounding. Everything will be okay, she told herself. Derek loves me. He won't abandon me just because I lost my job. We'll get through this together. But when the elevator doors opened, Victoria froze. Right outside the penthouse door, all her belongings had been neatly packed into suitcases and cardboard boxes. Clothes, shoes, handbags, makeup. Everything she owned was stacked in the hallway like trash waiting to be taken away. Victoria ran to the door and knocked, her heart racing out of control. Derek opened it. His white shirt was rumpled, his hair messy, and in the living room behind him, Victoria saw a blonde woman sitting on the sofa, wearing a silk robe Victoria recognized as her own. Derek, what's going on? Victoria asked, her voice trembling. Why are my things in the hallway? And who is that woman? Derek looked at her with a coldness she had never seen before. That's Melissa, he said without a hint of shame. She's the one replacing you. Victoria felt as if a knife had been plunged into her chest. Replacing me? I don't understand. We love each other. You promised you'd marry me. Derek laughed, the sound dry and cruel. Love? Victoria, do you really think I loved you? I needed a woman who could benefit my career. You were a promising junior partner. You had connections. You had a future. But now what are you? Unemployed, and someone who's angered the most powerful mafia boss in America. You're a liability, Victoria. And I don't need liabilities, Victoria stammered as tears began streaming down her face. But your father was fired too. Your family is in trouble. We can get through this together. Yes, Derek nodded. And who lost everything because of who? Because of you. Because you chose the wrong ex-husband. If you hadn't married that Volkov, if you hadn't despised him, if you hadn't thrown money in his face, my family wouldn't have been dragged into this mess. You're the source of every problem, Victoria, and I don't want you in my life anymore. Derek, please. Victoria dropped to her knees and grabbed his hand. Don't do this to me. I have no one else. I have nowhere to go. Please, give me a chance. Derek yanked his hand away, his face twisting as if he'd touched something filthy. Don't touch me, he said coldly. You smell like failure and desperation. I don't want it on me. Victoria stood frozen. She had heard that sentence before. She had said it herself, to Adrian, in that garage 3 weeks ago. You smell like grease and failure. Karma. This was karma. Derek stepped back inside and slammed the door in her face. She heard the lock click, then the laughter of the blonde woman echoing from within. Victoria collapsed among the suitcases and cardboard boxes, surrounded by expensive clothes and designer bags that meant nothing now. She cried. For the first time since everything began, she truly cried. Hot tears streamed down her face, soaking into the Chanel dress she had worn that morning when she still thought she was queen of the world. Now she was nothing but a homeless woman crying in the hallway of a luxury building she no longer belonged to. Victoria didn't know how long she sat there. An hour, maybe 2. Eventually, building security arrived and told her to leave. She gathered her belongings, stuffed what she could into 2 large suitcases, and stepped out onto the streets of Manhattan with swollen eyes and a shattered heart. She stood on the sidewalk, watching people pass by, and realized a bitter truth. She had no real friends. The people she'd called friends were just colleagues and social acquaintances. She had no family in New York. Her parents in New Jersey had cut ties with her when she left Adrian, the man they had always loved like a son. She had no one. Victoria dragged the heavy suitcases down the street, not knowing where she was going. And somewhere on the 50th floor of Volkov Tower, Adrian was looking down at the city with a cold smile on his lips. The game was still in motion, and she hadn't even reached the bottom yet. 1 week after being thrown out by Derek, Victoria found a studio apartment in the Bronx for $400 a month. It was on the 5th floor of an old building with no elevator, concrete stairs chipped and crumbling, the smell of dampness seeping into every corner. The space was barely 20 square meters, just enough room for a single bed, a tiny kitchen with 2 ancient gas burners, and a bathroom so narrow she had to turn sideways to close the door. The walls were stained yellow with age. The only window looked out onto a dark alley piled with trash bins. And at night, Victoria could hear rats running inside the walls. The first time she stepped inside, she stood frozen in the doorway for 10 full minutes. She thought of Derek's penthouse with its marble floors and sweeping view of Central Park. She thought of the apartment she had once shared with Adrian, the place she had mocked as cramped and miserable. Only now did she realize that apartment had been 100 times better than this. But she had no choice. The money left in her account would only cover 3 months of rent, after she had sold off the designer items Derek had bought her. The Hermes bags, the Chanel dresses, the Louboutin heels, all of it went for pennies at secondhand shops. Victoria watched the things that had once been her pride turn into wrinkled bills in her hands, and it felt as if a piece of her soul was being sold along with them. Finding work was even harder than finding a place to live. Victoria sent applications to dozens of law firms across New York, and no one replied. She called former colleagues who had once flattered her, and they either didn't answer or declined politely with vague excuses. Eventually, she discovered the bitter truth. Her name had been blacklisted in the legal world. Not officially, not in writing, but everyone knew. Anyone who hired Victoria Hayes would anger Volkov Holdings, and no one in Manhattan was insane enough to do that. After 2 weeks of hopeless searching in the legal field, Victoria was forced to accept reality. She was no longer a lawyer. She needed any job just to survive. And on a bleak Monday morning, Victoria Hayes, once a junior partner at Hamilton & Associates, walked into a small corner diner called Rosie's Diner and asked for a waitressing job. The owner, a 50-year-old woman named Maggie with dyed red hair and a wide smile, looked Victoria up and down. "Do you have any experience waiting tables?" Victoria shook her head. "No, but I learn fast." Maggie frowned. "Your hands look like they've never washed dishes." "What did you do before?" Victoria hesitated for a second, then said, "I worked in an office. The company went under. I lost my job." Maggie studied her for a few more seconds, then sighed. "All right, $8 an hour, plus tips. Shifts from 6 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon, and from 4 in the afternoon to 10 at night. You start today." And just like that, Victoria Hayes, who once wore Armani suits and Louboutin heels, now wore a grease-stained blue apron and cheap sneakers from a discount store. She carried plates, poured coffee, wiped tables, and cleared piles of filthy dishes left behind by customers. Her hands, once used only to signing million-dollar contracts, cracked and reddened from soaking too long in dishwater. Every day, Victoria woke at 5 in the morning in the dark studio, took a quick cold shower because the water heater had been broken for months and the landlord wouldn't fix it, then walked 20 minutes to the diner because she couldn't afford bus fare. She worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, earning just enough to pay rent and buy cheap food. Every night, when she returned to the tiny studio, Victoria lay on the single bed under a thin blanket, staring at the peeling ceiling, thinking about her old life. She thought of Derek's penthouse, of dinners at 5-star restaurants, of shopping trips along Fifth Avenue, and she thought of Adrian, the man she had once despised for being a mechanic, the man she had once thrown $100 at and told to buy new clothes. Now, $100 was what she earned after 3 days of back-breaking work, and she understood, for the first time in her life, she truly understood the value of $100, but that understanding came far too late, and the storm was far from over. A month passed after Victoria started working as a waitress at Rosie's Diner. A month of cold breakfasts, endless shifts, and silent nights crying in the tiny studio in the Bronx. A month of crushing loneliness as Victoria realized she had no one to call, no one to confide in, no one who cared whether she lived or died. And throughout that entire month, one thought haunted her relentlessly. Adrian. She had to see Adrian. She had to explain, to apologize, to beg for his forgiveness. Maybe he wouldn't listen. Maybe he would throw her out the way he had at Hamilton and Associates. But she had to try. She had nothing left to lose. And on a Sunday morning, her only day off of the week, Victoria stood in front of the mirror in the cramped bathroom and stared at her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked at least 10 years older than she had a month ago. Dark circles shadowed her eyes from lack of sleep. Her cheeks were hollow from poor nutrition, and her hair was brittle and lifeless because she couldn't afford decent shampoo. Victoria put on the most presentable clothes she still owned. A slightly wrinkled white blouse and black slacks with frayed hems. She no longer had lipstick or blush, only a bit of cheap moisturizer bought from a dollar store. But she didn't care about her appearance anymore. She only wanted to see Adrian. Volkov Tower rose over Manhattan like a monument to the distance between Victoria's world now and Adrian's world. She stood at the main entrance, looking up at the 50-story building with its wolf head crown, and felt so small she almost turned around and ran. But she didn't. She stepped inside. 2 guards in black suits stopped her immediately. One asked what she needed in a cold, impatient voice. And Victoria said she needed to see Mr. Adrian Volkov, that she was Victoria Hayes, his ex-wife. The guards exchanged a glance. One spoke into his radio, then told her, Mr. Volkov didn't have an appointment and she needed to leave. But Victoria didn't move. She begged them to tell him she needed just 5 minutes. And when the guard warned her again to leave before they escorted her out, desperation surged in her chest. She couldn't leave. This was her only chance. And then to the shock of the guards and everyone passing through the lobby, Victoria dropped to her knees. Her knees hit the cold marble floor, her hands clasped in front of her chest like she was praying as she begged loudly, admitting she was wrong, that she had hurt him, that she needed to talk to him and asking for mercy. The lobby of Volkov Tower fell into stunned silence as employees and visitors stared with curiosity and pity, the guards frozen and unsure how to handle it. Then footsteps echoed from the elevators, and Victoria looked up to see Nikolai approaching, his face unreadable as ever, telling her Mr. Volkov had agreed to see her and ordering her to follow him. Victoria stood up with throbbing knees and followed Nikolai into the elevator, saying nothing as the numbers climbed from 1 to 10 to 20 to 30 until the doors opened and she stood before the black oak doors leading into Adrian's office. Nikolai opened the door and gestured for her to enter. The vast office with floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking Manhattan spread out before her, and in the center behind a massive black oak desk sat Adrian, more handsome than ever in a charcoal gray suit and black shirt with no tie, his dark hair neatly styled, sharp features cold and composed, deep blue eyes looking at her the way one might look at an insect. He called her his ex-wife, and said he heard she had knelt in the lobby and begged to see him and asked what she wanted. Victoria walked to the center of the room on trembling legs, wanting to be strong and preserve the last shred of dignity she had left. But the moment she met his cold gaze, all her pride collapsed, and she dropped to her knees again right in front of his desk, apologizing, admitting she had been blind and cruel for 3 years, begging forgiveness and a second chance, saying she loved him, and Adrian looked down at the woman kneeling at his feet, the same woman who had kissed Derek Hamilton in a red Porsche in front of his garage, who had thrown $100 in his face and told him to buy new clothes, who had called him a mechanic and said he was nothing more than a stepping stone, now kneeling with tears streaming down her face, and he asked coldly if she loved him or the building, if she wanted a second chance with him or with his money, and Victoria insisted she truly loved him and had realized it too late. Adrian stood and slowly walked around the desk until he stood directly in front of her, bent down until his face was inches from hers, and reminded her of the 3 years he worked like a dog to pay off her debts, the 3 years he came home with cracked hands and clothes reeking of engine oil, the 3 years he endured her look of disgust, then straightened and looked down at her with empty eyes and told her she never loved him, only herself and what he could give her, that now she begged not out of love but fear and desperation because she had no one else to cling to. Then he turned his back on her and walked to the window, gazing down at the city below, and without turning around told her the answer was no. He didn't forgive her, wouldn't give her a second chance, never wanted to see her face again. Nikolai would escort her out, and she was never to come back. Victoria didn't stand up. She remained kneeling there, tears streaming down her cheeks, both hands gripping the edge of Adrian's desk, as if it were the last lifeline keeping her from drowning. She couldn't accept that answer. She couldn't believe everything ended like this. "Adrian, please," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "You can't do this to me. We loved each other once. We were husband and wife. Didn't those 3 years mean anything to you?" Adrian turned back, and Victoria saw something flash in his deep blue eyes. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't softness. It was anger, cold and terrifying, like a volcano simmering beneath solid ice. 3 years? Adrian stepped closer, his voice calm but every word sharp as a blade. "You want to talk about 3 years? Fine, I'll tell you about 3 years." He stopped directly in front of her, looking down with eyes cold as a Siberian winter. 3 years I woke up at 5 every morning to go to the garage. 3 years I worked 12 hours a day fixing cars, changing oil, lying under engines with grease dripping into my eyes. 3 years I came home with cracked hands and an aching back. And do you know what you did? You frowned. You turned away. You told me to shower immediately because I smelled. Adrian bent down, his face only inches from hers. "Do you know how it feels when your own wife looks at you like you're trash? Do you know how much humiliation I swallowed every time you compared me to your friends' husbands? To men in suits driving luxury cars? Do you know how many times I hoped that one day you'd look at me and say you were proud of me?" Victoria sobbed uncontrollably. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." Adrian straightened, his laughter echoing coldly through the room. "You didn't know? Of course you didn't, because you never bothered to ask. You never cared. You only saw the mechanic's uniform and the cheap rented apartment. You never asked about my family, my past, or what I gave up to be with you, because to you I was just a poor mechanic, a stepping stone for you to climb." He walked to the liquor cabinet, poured himself a glass of whiskey, then turned back to Victoria, still kneeling on the floor. "Do you know which sentence hurt the most, Victoria? Not when you called me a mechanic. Not when you kissed Derek right in front of me. But when you said thank you for paying off my student loans and told me you didn't need me anymore." Adrian took a sip of whiskey, his eyes never leaving her. "Do you know what that meant? It meant that for 3 years you saw me as nothing more than an ATM. You used me to pay your debts, to buy yourself time to study, to build your career. And when you'd taken everything you needed, you threw me away like a used tissue. You didn't love me. You never did. You only loved what I could do for you." Victoria shook her head frantically. "No, it wasn't like that. I was wrong. But I did love you. I was blind. I was stupid." Adrian set the glass down and stepped toward her. He bent down, grabbed her chin, and forced her to look into his eyes. "You want to talk about love? Fine. I'll tell you what love is. Love is giving up everything to live an ordinary life with you. Love is having any woman in the world and choosing you. Love is enduring 3 years of contempt, humiliation, and being treated like garbage because I wanted to believe you truly loved me." He released her chin and shoved her backward onto the floor. "But you proved me wrong. You proved my mother right. No one loves me for who I am. They love my money, my power, what I can give them. And you, Victoria, are the clearest proof of that." Victoria lay on the floor, crying silently, her throat too tight to speak. Adrian walked to the window, turning his back to her. "You know, Victoria, there's one thing you said to me in the garage that day. You said I smelled like oil and failure." He turned back, his gaze sweeping over her wrinkled clothes and hollow face. "Look at you now. Brittle hair, cheap clothes, knees scraped from kneeling on the floor. What do you smell like now, Victoria? You smell like cold coffee and desperation. Exactly what you said about me." Victoria trembled, trying to stand, but her legs wouldn't obey. Adrian stepped closer, and for a moment she thought he might help her up. Instead, he pulled a bill from his suit pocket and tossed it onto her chest. $100. Buy yourself some new clothes. This outfit looks pathetic." Victoria stared at the bill, and she understood. This was exactly what she had done to him in the garage. She had thrown $100 in his face, told him to buy new clothes, treated him like a beggar, and now he was giving it back to her piece by piece. Karma missed no one. "Nikolai," Adrian called out, "take her out, and make sure she's never allowed back into this building again." The door opened and Nikolai entered, grabbing Victoria by the arm and hauling her to her feet without much gentleness. She wanted to struggle, to scream, to cling to Adrian one last time, but she had no strength left. She let Nikolai drag her out of the office, out of the elevator, out of the Volkov Tower lobby, and shove her onto the Manhattan sidewalk. The $100 bill was still clenched in her hand, crumpled and soaked with tears. Victoria stood there, staring up at the 50-story tower cutting into the blue sky, and she knew she had lost Adrian forever, and that pain was worse than anything she'd ever known. Not because of money, not because of power, but because for the first time, she truly understood what she had lost. She had lost a man willing to give up everything for her, and she realized it only when it was far too late. 2 weeks passed since the day Victoria was thrown out of Volkov Tower with a crumpled $100 bill in her hand. 2 weeks of numbness and emptiness as she worked at Rosie's diner like a walking corpse, carrying plates, pouring coffee, wiping tables, forcing herself not to think about anything, trying to forget Adrian's cold eyes, trying to forget the cruel words he'd spoken, trying to forget the truth that she had lost everything because of her own stupidity, and that Wednesday morning began like any other. Victoria arrived at the diner at 6, tied on her familiar blue apron, and started preparing for her shift. The place was busy as usual, mostly construction workers and truck drivers, grabbing breakfast before work. Victoria moved between tables, taking orders, serving food, forcing a smile while she slowly died inside. And at 9, the door opened and 2 men walked in. She didn't notice them at first, assuming they were just customers, but when she looked up and saw them heading straight toward her, her heart began to race. They wore dark jackets, and the way they moved, confident and purposeful, told her they weren't there for breakfast. "Victoria Hayes," the man in front asked, his voice carrying through the diner and making people turn to look. "Yes, I'm Victoria," she answered, her voice trembling slightly. "What's this about?" The man pulled a badge from his pocket and held it up. "Detective Morrison, NYPD. This is my partner. Detective Chen, you're under arrest for embezzlement, securities fraud, and money laundering." The diner fell into stunned silence. Every eye turned toward Victoria, and she felt as if the ground were collapsing beneath her feet. Embezzlement, fraud. She didn't understand what they were talking about. This had to be a mistake. It had to be, "I don't understand," she stammered. "I didn't embezzle or defraud anyone. You've got the wrong person." Detective Morrison shook his head, pulled out a stack of papers, and read aloud that during her time at Hamilton and Associates, she had transferred $150,000 from client trust accounts into her personal account, money used to purchase luxury items including a Cartier watch, Hermes handbags, and the security deposit on a penthouse, with full evidence including bank transfer records, purchase receipts, and text messages between her and Derek Hamilton discussing how to use the funds. Victoria froze, remembering the times Derek encouraged her to use company money, telling her it was a bonus she deserved, promising he'd handle the paperwork, saying no one would ever know. And she, blind and foolish with love, had believed him. No, she shook her head wildly. "It was Derek. He told me to do it. He said he'd take care of everything. I didn't know it was illegal." Detective Chen stepped forward and pulled out handcuffs, informing her of her right to remain silent and to an attorney. The click of the cuffs echoed through the quiet diner, sharp and final, cold metal tightening around her wrists as she broke down in tears, not from pain but from humiliation, from despair, from the deep certainty that this wasn't coincidence. This was Adrian. He'd uncovered her secret and handed it to the police. Maggie, the diner owner, stood behind the counter staring in shock, asking what Victoria had done, saying she didn't believe she was that kind of person. But Detective Morrison didn't answer, simply took Victoria by the arm and led her outside. She walked past the stares of customers who moments earlier had called her waitress and asked for refills. A police car waited outside. She was pushed into the back seat. The door slammed shut, and she sat there staring out the window as the car pulled away, watching Rosie's diner grow smaller, watching the fragile normal life she'd tried to rebuild disappear. And somewhere in the city she knew Adrian was watching. She could picture him in his office on the 50th floor of Volkov Tower, taking a sip of whiskey and smiling. His game wasn't over, and she, Victoria Hayes, was nothing more than a pawn that had been checkmated long before she ever realized it. The trial took place 3 months after the day Victoria was arrested, 3 months spent in pre-trial detention, where she slept on a hard iron bed, ate bland, tasteless meals, and counted each passing day in despair. Victoria had no money to hire a competent attorney, so she was assigned a public defender, a young man fresh out of law school with mountains of files on his desk, and not enough time to truly care about her case. He met Victoria exactly twice before the trial, each meeting lasting less than 30 minutes, and once he even called her by the wrong name. Victoria knew she was going to lose. She just didn't know how badly. Courtroom number 7 of the Manhattan Criminal Court was packed that morning. Reporters, journalists, and curious onlookers filled the gallery, all eager to witness the sensational case that had dominated headlines for 3 months. Victoria Hayes, former attorney at Hamilton and Associates and ex-wife of Mafia boss Adrian Volkov, stood trial for embezzlement and fraud. The media had squeezed every drop from this story, and today was its climax. Victoria sat at the defendant's table, wearing an orange prison uniform, her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked much thinner than 3 months earlier, her cheeks hollow, dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back to reveal a pale face without a trace of makeup. She stared straight ahead, forcing herself not to react to the probing stares from every corner of the courtroom. The prosecutor was a middle-aged woman, with silver hair and eyes sharp as blades. She presented the case with the calm confidence of someone who knew she would win. The evidence against Victoria was overwhelming. Bank records showed that $150,000 had been transferred from client trust accounts into Victoria's personal account over 6 months. Luxury purchase receipts matched the timing of the transfers, and worst of all were the messages. Hundreds of texts between Victoria and Derek Hamilton, discussing how to use the money and hide the trail. Victoria watched the evidence projected on the screen and felt herself sinking into an abyss. She wanted to scream that it had been Derek's idea, that he had manipulated her, that she had been nothing more than a puppet in his hands. But she knew no one would believe her. Then the prosecutor called the most important witness. The court summoned Derek Hamilton. Victoria spun around at the sound of his name. She watched him enter the courtroom in a light gray suit, hair neatly styled, his serious expression carefully rehearsed. He didn't look at her once as he passed the defense table. He walked straight to the witness stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. "Mr. Hamilton," the prosecutor began, "can you describe your relationship with the defendant Victoria Hayes?" Derek nodded, his face arranged into an expression of calculated sorrow. "We dated for about 2 months. She told me she had just divorced and needed emotional support. I believed her. I loved her." Victoria clenched her teeth, her nails digging into her palms until they nearly bled. And regarding the embezzled funds, the prosecutor continued. Derek sighed, performing flawlessly. "I knew nothing about it until the police contacted me. She told me the money was hers, bonuses from the firm, savings from before her marriage. I had no reason to doubt her. She was a lawyer. She understood the law better than I did. I was deceived too. I'm a victim here. Lies." Victoria sprang to her feet, shouting across the courtroom. "He's lying. He told me to take the money. He said he'd handle everything. He promised he'd marry me if I did what he said." The judge slammed the gavel down. "Silence. The defendant will sit immediately or be held in contempt of court." Victoria's attorney pulled her back into her seat, but she couldn't take her eyes off Derek. He was looking at her now for the first time since entering the courtroom, and in his eyes she saw something that made her blood run cold. Indifference. He didn't care. He felt no remorse. He was saving himself, and she was nothing more than a sacrifice. Derek's lawyer stood and presented documents showing his client's supposed lack of involvement, messages edited to remove incriminating sections, financial records arranged so all blame pointed to Victoria. He had prepared for this scenario long ago, perhaps even before her arrest, and Victoria understood the bitter truth. She had never been Derek's girlfriend. She had been a disposable pawn in his plan, someone meant to take the fall when everything collapsed, and she had been too blind to see it. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury needed less than 1 hour to reach a verdict. The foreperson stood and announced that on the charge of embezzlement, the defendant was guilty. On the charge of securities fraud, the defendant was guilty. On the charge of money laundering, the defendant was guilty. Each word struck Victoria like a hammer to the chest. She didn't cry. She had cried too much in the past 3 months, and had no tears left. She sat there numb as the judge read the sentence. "Victoria Hayes, your crimes represent the worst form of greed and betrayal of trust in the legal profession. You abused your position to steal from clients who relied on you. You have shown no genuine remorse or accountability. Therefore, I sentence you to 10 years in federal prison. Your license to practice law is permanently revoked." 10 years. The air felt ripped from her lungs. 10 years of her life swallowed by prison walls. She would be 42 when she was released, with no career, no money, no future. As she was led from the courtroom, Victoria saw Derek shaking hands with his lawyer, relief on his face. He had escaped. He had betrayed her, and walked free. And in the back row of the courtroom, in a shadowed corner she almost didn't notice, Nikolai stood with his arms crossed, watching everything. He gave Victoria a small nod, a silent farewell, then turned and walked out. Victoria knew he would report back to Adrian, and she knew that somewhere in the city, Adrian was receiving the news with the cold satisfaction of a man who had just finished his game. 5 years passed like a long and dark dream. Victoria Hayes, Once a promising attorney at Hamilton and Associates, once a woman who lived in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, who wore Chanel and walked in Louboutin heels, now stepped through the gates of a federal prison with a small duffel bag and $200 in reintegration assistance. She was released early after 5 years for good behavior, but 5 years behind bars had turned her into someone else entirely. Her once glossy black hair was now threaded with gray, even though she was only 37. Her face was gaunt with deep lines around her eyes and mouth, her shoulders permanently hunched as if bearing the invisible weight of regret and humiliation. Victoria was no longer the woman she had been 5 years earlier. She was someone life had crushed and spat back out. Finding work with an embezzlement record was nearly impossible. No company wanted to hire a former inmate, especially one convicted of financial fraud. Victoria submitted applications everywhere from retail stores to coffee shops and was rejected every time after background checks. Finally, after 2 months living in a homeless shelter, she found work at a catering company called Silver Spoon Events. They didn't ask much about her past, only that she could carry trays and stay out of trouble. $8 an hour, no insurance, no benefits. Victoria accepted immediately. She rented a tiny room in Queens smaller than the Bronx studio she'd lived in 5 years earlier, for $300 a month. Barely enough space for a single bed and a narrow wardrobe. No window, and a shared bathroom with 4 other tenants on the same floor. But Victoria didn't complain. She'd learned not to complain over the past 5 years. One Saturday evening, the manager at Silver Spoon Events called her into the office and told her there was a major event in Brooklyn that night. A charity gala for the Volkov Foundation. They needed extra servers, and the pay was double. Did she want to go? Victoria froze at the name Volkov. Her heart skipped a beat, and she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. The Volkov Foundation. Adrian Volkov, the man she had betrayed, the man who had destroyed her life, the man she had thought about every night for 5 years. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to say no. But she needed the money, and she had no right to choose. Yes, I'll go, she heard herself say as if the voice came from far away. The Volkov Foundation Charity Gala was held in a renovated warehouse in Brooklyn, transformed into a luxurious event space. When Victoria entered through the staff entrance, she was overwhelmed by the opulence. Crystal chandeliers glittered beneath soaring ceilings. Banquet tables draped in pristine white linens with fresh flowers and scented candles. Polished wooden floors reflecting the lights like a giant mirror. And the guests, hundreds of them in expensive suits and evening gowns, laughing, talking, sipping champagne as if money didn't exist. Victoria wore a server's uniform. White shirt, black slacks, hair pulled neatly back. She looked like a ghost among the glittering crowd, invisible and unnoticed. Exactly what she wanted. She only needed to carry trays, avoid the VIP area, and leave with double pay. She didn't need to see Adrian. She didn't want to see Adrian. But fate had other plans. As the gala reached its peak, a man stepped onto the stage and the room fell silent. Victoria stood in a corner holding a tray of champagne when she looked up and saw him. Adrian Volkov. 5 years hadn't aged him. They'd only made him more powerful. His black hair still thick and glossy with a few silver strands at the temples, lending him an air of authority. His sharp features, clean-shaven, his deep blue eyes gleaming under the stage lights. Dressed in a flawless black tuxedo, he stood at the microphone like a king granting blessings to his subjects. "Tonight we gather for a higher purpose," Adrian began, his warm, confident voice carrying across the room. The Volkov Foundation was created with a mission to offer second chances to those who have fallen. We believe everyone deserves redemption. Everyone deserves the chance to begin again. Victoria stood frozen, the champagne tray trembling in her hands. Second chances, redemption. The words stabbed into her heart. Adrian was standing on stage, speaking of forgiveness and renewal, while she, the woman who had once begged him for forgiveness, stood in a corner, wearing a server's uniform with hands cracked from washing dishes. The bitterness of the irony was almost enough to make her laugh, but she didn't. She only watched him accept applause and admiring smiles from the crowd, and wondered if he knew she was there, if he cared at all. And then, as if answering her question, the catering manager appeared beside her and whispered, "Take this tray of canapés to the VIP table." Now, Victoria looked down at the tray in her hands, then toward the VIP table, where Adrian had just stepped down from the stage, surrounded by influential guests. Her legs felt filled with lead, but she had no choice. She walked forward one step at a time, moving toward the man she had once despised and now had to serve. Victoria approached the VIP table with trembling legs and a heart pounding wildly in her chest. She tried to keep the tray of canapés steady, tried to keep her head lowered, tried to make herself invisible among the glittering crowd. She only needed to set the tray down and leave. Only needed Adrian not to see her face. Only a few more seconds. But fate had its own cruel sense of humor. As Victoria reached the VIP table, one of the guests suddenly turned to greet an acquaintance. His elbow struck her arm hard and she lost her balance. The tray tilted, and as if in slow motion, the smoked salmon slid off, fell, and landed directly on the black tuxedo of Adrian Volkov. The entire hall went silent. The music still played, but no one heard it. Every gaze turned toward the VIP table, where a thin server stood, frozen with an empty tray in her hands, and the most powerful man on the East Coast stared down at the stain on his jacket. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. She took a deep breath and did the only thing instinct told her to do. She dropped to her knees. Her knees hit the polished wooden floor, her shaking hands clutching a napkin as she tried to wipe the stain from Adrian's shoes while stammering apologies. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Mr. Volkov, it was an accident. Please don't fire me. I need this job. Please have mercy on me." And then, as if she could no longer hold it back, Victoria looked up at him, her reddened brown eyes meeting his cold, deep blue gaze as she whispered through sobs, "Adrian, it's me, Victoria. I've paid for everything. I suffered for 5 years in prison. I'm begging you to forgive me." The hall remained suffocatingly silent as everyone waited for Adrian's reaction. Waited for rage, waited for revenge, waited for anything. But what happened next was more brutal than anything they imagined. Adrian tilted his head and looked down at the woman kneeling at his feet. He took in the prematurely gray hair, the gaunt face lined with wrinkles, the cracked hands clutching the napkin. Then he spoke in a tone polite and distant, as if addressing a complete stranger. "It's all right. Accidents happen to everyone. Please stand up." Victoria looked at him with eyes full of hope and desperation. "Adrian, don't you recognize me? We were married. I'm Victoria, Victoria Hayes. I was wrong. I regretted it every single day for 5 years. Please look at me." Adrian looked at her and she saw the worst thing she could have seen. No hatred, no anger, no pain, only complete emptiness. As if he were looking at a passerby, he would forget the moment he walked away. "I'm afraid you've mistaken me for someone else," Adrian said gently and indifferently. "I don't recall ever meeting you." He turned to Nikolai, standing behind him, and said, "Nikolai, make sure she gets a clean towel and a tip. She seems to be having a difficult night." Nikolai nodded and stepped toward Victoria. He took her elbow gently but firmly and helped her stand. Then he pressed something into her hand. Victoria looked down. It was a $100 bill, crisp and new. Exactly like the one she had thrown in Adrian's face at the garage 6 years earlier. Exactly like the one Adrian had thrown at her in Volkov Tower 5 years earlier. Nikolai leaned down and whispered coldly in her ear. "Mr. Volkov asked me to tell you to buy yourself some new clothes." Victoria stood frozen in the middle of the hall. The $100 bill crumpled in her hand as she watched Adrian turn away and merge back into the glittering crowd of the rich and powerful. He didn't look back. Not once. And Victoria understood the most brutal truth of all. She was no longer Adrian's enemy, no longer his pain. She wasn't even his memory. She was no one, just a clumsy server who spilled food on a guest. Just another anonymous face in the crowd. Just a fading shadow he would forget when the night ended. Adrian's final revenge wasn't hatred, wasn't anger, wasn't prison or ruin. It was indifference. Complete and absolute indifference. He had erased her from his life the way one wipes a stain from fabric. Victoria tightened her grip on the $100 bill, lowered her head, and quietly returned to the kitchen. She washed dishes until the gala ended, until the last guest left, until her hands burned red from soaking too long in water. Outside, Adrian stepped into the waiting Rolls-Royce. Nikolai took the front seat and asked through the rearview mirror if he was all right. Adrian gazed out the window as city lights passed like stars and replied that he was fine, then asked who she was. Nikolai said nothing and Adrian said nothing. The car disappeared into the night, leaving Victoria's story in darkness. The story of Adrian and Victoria stands as a brutal reminder that the wheel of fate never stops turning. Those who believe they've won today may become the losers tomorrow, and those despised today may one day hold the destiny of those who once looked down on them. Victoria believed a person's worth was measured by the suit they wore, the car they drove, and the balance in their bank account. She was wrong. True value lies in character, in loyalty, in the ability to love someone not for what they have but for who they are. She signed divorce papers with a diamond, thinking it was a stone, and when she realized the truth, it was too late to turn back. In the end, the greatest punishment isn't prison, isn't losing money or status. It's becoming meaningless, being erased from the memory of the person you once hurt, realizing you've become no one in the eyes of the person who once loved you most, and that is how a single contemptuous signature cost a woman everything she believed she had won. What do you think about Adrian's final reaction? Was his indifference the harshest punishment of all? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd truly love to hear what this story stirred deep in your heart and how it connects to real life. If you found this story meaningful and want to hear more moving stories every day, please subscribe, like, and share this video with those you care about. Your support is our greatest motivation to keep bringing you quality stories. We wish all of you watching good health, a joyful life, and peace of mind every day. Remember to love the people beside you for who they are, not for what they have. Goodbye and see you in the next video.